all discovered by one struggling farmer's desperate attempt to save his drought-stricken land and the abandoned well that would reveal California's most profitable gold rush stagecoach, preserved beneath his barren fields for almost a century and a half. The July sun blazed mercilessly against the cracked earth of the old farmstead as Daniel Fletcher descended the rusting metal ladder into what had become his last hope. At 42, he never imagined he'd be fighting to keep the dilapidated family farm, where he and his 3 children had hoped to build a better life after his wife's death. But here he stood, surrounded by the dry, dusty remnants of what was once their only functioning well, clutching a foreclosure notice that gave him exactly 30 days to make the property profitable or watch the bank claim their only asset forever. The drought had begun during the worst summer California's Central Valley had witnessed in decades. What should have been minor irrigation concerns during dry spells had transformed into catastrophe when the region's water table had dropped catastrophically, leaving thousands of acres of farmland parched and worthless across the once fertile valley. The historic homestead, built in 1878, had weathered over 145 years of California's cycles of plenty and scarcity, but it wasn't designed to withstand the climate crisis that had overwhelmed their struggling community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel unfolded the crumpled foreclosure notice from his pocket, reading it for the 20th time that morning. The bureaucratic language was cold and impersonal, reducing his family's dreams to a series of loan delinquencies and property assessments. Western Pacific Bank property subject to immediate foreclosure due to payment delinquency, drought damage, and significant reduction in property value. Final notice: payment in full required within 30 days or property will be seized and auctioned. The weight of those words pressed down on Daniel like the relentless California sun outside. He surveyed the abandoned well that had once held so much promise, the source that had irrigated generations of Fletcher crops and sustained the family through previous droughts. Now it was a dusty pit filled with rocks and debris that carried the remnants of their modest farming equipment, broken pipes, a rusty pump, and the scattered remains of the life they'd struggled to build. The irony was crushing. Daniel had spent 15 years working in agricultural engineering, understanding irrigation systems better than most. He'd returned to this farm precisely because he believed his skills could transform the neglected property into a sustainable operation his family could be proud of. The $585,000 mortgage they'd taken to modernize the farm had stretched his finances to the breaking point. But the opportunity seemed worth the risk. Now, just 18 months after investing everything, they faced losing it all. The economic downturn had hit his family hard. Crop prices had plummeted, leaving Daniel cobbling together side jobs that barely covered their $2,850 monthly mortgage. His veterans' benefits helped, but the $1,800 monthly income mostly went to utilities, food, and his youngest son's baseball equipment. Their modest savings had been depleted by the down payment and unexpected repairs the ancient irrigation system had required. What was supposed to be their family legacy was crumbling before his eyes, turning to dust like the parched soil beneath their feet. The California sun beat down relentlessly as Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. The temperature had reached 104 degrees by noon, typical for July in the Central Valley. 5 generations of Fletchers had worked this land through good times and bad. But never had they faced such a perfect storm of challenges: financial pressure, extreme drought, and plummeting agricultural prices all converging at once. The news reports called it the worst drought in recorded history, but such clinical descriptions failed to capture the human toll it was taking on farming families across the state. "Dad, this equipment isn't powerful enough," called out his teenage daughter, Emma, who stood beside him at the edge of the dried-up well. trying to position a rental backhoe that seemed woefully inadequate for the task. The engine roared with effort, but the hard-packed clay and rock barely seemed to budge. "We need something industrial grade, and we need to find where the water table has dropped to." Emma was a good kid, 17 years old, with the kind of determined intelligence that reminded Daniel of his own mother. Despite being on summer break, she'd volunteered to help rather than spending time with friends. His younger sons, Caleb and Noah, were staying with Daniel's brother while they fought to save their farm. The boys, aged 10 and 8, didn't fully understand the gravity of their situation, but they knew enough to be scared about losing their home. Daniel had tried to shield them from the worst of his worries, but children had an uncanny way of sensing when adults were afraid, no matter how brave a face you put on. Each night, Daniel would call them, forcing cheerfulness into his voice as he assured them that everything would be okay, even as the reality of their circumstances grew increasingly dire. Daniel looked around the abandoned well that had once been the lifeblood of their property. The concrete casing was cracked and crumbling, with decades of repairs visible in the patchwork of different materials. His great-grandfather had dug this well by hand in the late 1800s, and subsequent generations had maintained and deepened it as needed. According to family lore, it had never run completely dry, even during the Dust Bowl years. Until now. The historic well had finally succumbed to the changing climate and overuse of the aquifer by industrial farming operations that surrounded their modest 80-acre plot. "Emma, we can't afford better equipment," Daniel replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "The rental on this little backhoe is already $350 a day. We can't get to the water table with what we have. I'm afraid we're going to lose the farm." He'd done the math obsessively over the past 30 days. The equipment rental was already stretching their emergency credit card to the limit. The estimate for professional well drilling was $27,000, more than their remaining credit and available cash combined. The irrigation system repairs needed to make the land productive, again, would cost at least $15,500 more. Even if they could somehow afford the immediate repairs, they'd still need to address the depleted soil, the failing tractor, and a dozen other maintenance issues that had been accumulating since they had taken over the property. The drought had exposed every weakness in their operation, turning what should have been manageable challenges into existential threats. Each passing day without water meant another portion of their potential harvest withered and died, reducing their chances of generating enough income to satisfy the bank. The Fletcher farmstead had been established during California's post-gold rush period, when the fertile valley attracted farmers from across America looking to feed the booming population. Originally owned by Daniel's great-great-grandfather, Samuel Fletcher, a carpenter who had followed the gold rush west, but arrived too late to strike it rich in the mines. The farm had passed through several generations before falling into disrepair in the early 2000s when Daniel's father died suddenly of a heart attack. The property had been leased to corporate farming interests for nearly 8 years, giving Daniel time to serve in the military and earn his agricultural engineering degree before returning to reclaim his heritage. The region was changing rapidly. What had once been a patchwork of family farms was being consolidated by agribusiness conglomerates that could afford to drill deeper wells and implement advanced irrigation technologies beyond the reach of small farmers. 5 properties bordering theirs had been purchased by investment companies in the past year, converted to water-intensive cash crops, and now those corporate entities were circling the Fletcher farm like vultures, waiting for the inevitable foreclosure so they could expand their operations further. Daniel had watched the transformation with a mixture of admiration for the technological advances and anxiety about the environmental impact that would further strain the region's depleted aquifer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Dad, there might be assistance programs for drought victims," Emma suggested hopefully. "Maybe the state has resources we don't know about." Daniel shook his head, having already explored every available option with the thoroughness of someone fighting for survival. "I've called everyone. Emma, the USDA says this doesn't qualify for emergency assistance because our operation is too small. The state says their drought relief funds are exhausted from the bigger farms down valley. The farm aid organizations can provide temporary support for groceries, but not capital improvements and our insurance." He gestured helplessly at the dried-up well surrounding them. "Apparently, this kind of gradual drought damage isn't covered under our policy." The insurance situation was particularly infuriating. Daniel had carefully reviewed their farm policy before investing, ensuring they had what seemed like adequate coverage, but the fine print contained exclusions that he hadn't fully understood. The policy covered sudden crop losses from specific natural disasters, but specifically excluded losses caused by gradually developing conditions, such as drought. The region's water crisis was considered a known risk rather than a sudden catastrophe, creating a legal loophole that left them without coverage for exactly the kind of disaster they faced. Daniel had spent hours on the phone with the insurance company, explaining their situation to representatives who seemed sympathetic but powerless to help. The claims adjuster who'd visited had been apologetic but firm. Gradually developing drought conditions were explicitly excluded under standard agricultural policies. If Daniel wanted that kind of protection, he would have needed separate specialized drought insurance, which cost thousands of dollars annually and had become practically impossible to obtain in their region as climate conditions worsened. "What if we sell some of the equipment?" Emma asked, her young face creased with worry beyond her years. "The tractor is old, but it still works. Maybe we could get enough to rent a proper drilling rig." Daniel sighed, having already considered and rejected that option. "The tractor's worth maybe $8,000 on a good day, and we need it if we're going to harvest anything this season. Besides, without irrigation, there won't be anything to harvest anyway." The financial trap they were in seemed perfect in its cruelty. They needed water to grow crops, needed money to access water, and needed crops to make money. The cycle of dependence was impossible to break without an injection of capital they simply didn't have. Emma jumped down into the well, landing on the dry, cracked earth at the bottom. "There's got to be something we can do," she insisted, her voice echoing against the concrete walls. "Maybe we could dig deeper by hand, like great-great-grandpa Samuel did." Daniel smiled sadly at his daughter's determination. She had inherited the Fletcher stubbornness, the unwillingness to accept defeat that had carried their family through previous hardships. But this time, determination alone wouldn't be enough. The water table had dropped by over 60 feet in the past decade, far beyond what they could reach with manual labor. "Be careful down there," Daniel cautioned as Emma began clearing away loose debris from the well floor. "Those walls haven't been maintained properly in years." He watched as she worked, methodically removing rocks and soil, driven by the desperate hope that somehow they might find moisture if they just dug a little deeper. The California sun beat down overhead, casting harsh shadows into the well where his daughter labored. Daniel felt the familiar weight of paternal guilt, the knowledge that his children were suffering for decisions he had made, risks he had taken. He had brought them back to this farm with promises of a legacy, of roots and stability after years of moving from military base to base. Now those promises seemed as hollow as the dried-up well. Emma had been working for almost an hour, creating a small depression in the center of the well floor, when her shovel hit something with a distinctive metallic clang. "Dad, there's something down here," she called up, excitement creeping into her voice for the first time in weeks. "I think it might be part of the old pumping system." Daniel climbed on the rusty ladder to join her, curiosity momentarily displacing his despair. The Fletcher family had stories about the various innovations each generation had implemented to keep the farm viable. Perhaps they'd uncovered some forgotten, Piece of agricultural history. As they cleared away more soil, they revealed what appeared to be a large metal plate, roughly 4 feet across, covered in a pattern of rivets around its circumference. "This doesn't look like any pump casing I've ever seen," Daniel muttered, brushing away decades of accumulated dirt to reveal an unusual circular pattern etched into the metal. "It almost looks like—" His voice trailed off as recognition dawned. "Emma, I think this might be the top of an old safe or strongbox. Help me clear more of it." Working together with renewed energy, father and daughter excavated around the edges of the metal disc, revealing what was unmistakably the top of a large circular safe, buried deeply beneath the well floor. Why would anyone put a safe at the bottom of a well? Emma wondered aloud as they continued to dig around the perimeter. Daniel's mind raced through historical possibilities. The well dates back to the 1870s, right after the gold rush period. People didn't trust banks much back then, especially out here in farm country. Maybe one of our ancestors decided this was the safest place to store valuables. As they exposed more of the safe, they discovered a complex combination lock mechanism, now green with verdigris and seized with age and soil minerals. "We're never going to get this open without professional help," Daniel said, examining the corroded mechanism. "And we can't afford to hire anyone right now." He was calculating the costs in his head. A locksmith with experience in antique safes would charge hundreds, if not thousands, for a job this specialized. Money they simply didn't have. "What if we just try to break it open?" Emma suggested pragmatically. "It's already buried in our well. It's not like we're going to damage a family heirloom. If there's anything valuable inside, it might help save the farm." Daniel considered her suggestion. Under normal circumstances, he would have preferred to preserve the historical integrity of the find, perhaps even contact a museum. But these weren't normal circumstances. They were fighting for survival, and sentimentality was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Let's try the backhoe," Daniel decided after a moment's consideration. "If we can get a chain around it, maybe we can pull it loose." The next hour was spent carefully attaching chains around the exposed portion of the safe, a painstaking process complicated by the confined space and the fragile condition of the well walls. Finally, with Emma operating the backhoe and Daniel guiding the chains from below, they began to apply steady pressure to the buried object. The ancient safe resisted at first, held in place by decades of compacted soil and its own considerable weight. Daniel worried the chains might snap or the backhoe prove insufficient for the task. But then, with a sudden groan of protesting metal and the sound of soil giving way, the safe shifted. "Keep going," Daniel shouted up to Emma, excitement building despite his attempts to manage expectations. The safe could easily be empty, he reminded himself, or contain nothing but molded papers and photographs, worthless except for their historical interest. With one final heave, the safe broke free from its earthen prison, revealing not a small lockbox as they had expected, but the ornate roof of what appeared to be a Stagecoach strongbox, still partially buried in the soil. "Hold up, Emma," Daniel called, staring in disbelief at what they had uncovered. "This isn't just a safe. I think it's a Wells Fargo strongbox. The kind they used to transport gold during the gold rush." His mind was racing through the historical implications. Stagecoaches had traversed California in the mid-1800s, carrying mail, passengers, and occasionally significant quantities of gold from the mines to San Francisco banks. As they excavated further, their discovery proved even more extraordinary than Daniel had initially thought. It wasn't merely a strongbox, but an entire stagecoach buried vertically in the earth, with only its roof and strongbox compartment reaching up to where the well had later been constructed. "This doesn't make any sense," Daniel muttered, brushing away soil to reveal ornate metal workmanship that had been preserved by the unusual burial conditions. Why would someone bury an entire stagecoach? And how did our ancestors not find this when digging the well? Emma, whose history classes had covered California's gold rush period, offered a theory. "Dad, what if the Stagecoach was robbed? This region had famous stagecoach bandits in the 1860s. Maybe they buried their stolen loot here before the land was even a farm. And then our great-great-grandfather unknowingly dug a well right on top of it decades later." The theory made a certain historical sense. The chaos of the gold rush period had given rise to numerous robberies, with stolen gold sometimes hidden and never recovered when bandits were captured or killed. As they worked to expose more of the buried vehicle, Daniel noticed a small plaque affixed to the strongbox compartment. Wiping away decades of dirt, he read aloud, "Wells Fargo and Company Express. Sacramento to San Francisco route, coach No. 42. Emma gasped. "Dad, I've heard of this. We studied it in California history last year. Coach 42 was carrying one of the largest gold shipments ever recorded when it disappeared in 1868. They never found it. Everyone assumed the bandits got away with the gold." Daniel's heart raced as the historical significance of their discovery dawned on him. If this truly was the legendary Coach 42, they might have stumbled upon one of the greatest lost treasures in California history. The coach had reportedly been carrying over $300,000 in raw gold, equivalent to millions in today's currency, when it vanished without a trace between Sacramento and San Francisco. According to historical records, neither the coach, the gold, nor the bodies of the driver and guard were ever recovered, leading to countless theories and treasure-hunting expeditions over the subsequent century and a half. "We need to open that strongbox," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The implications were enormous, not just for their immediate financial crisis, but for the historical record as well. This was a significant archaeological find that belonged in a museum. But it was also potentially their salvation, the miracle they had been praying for as foreclosure loomed. The moral and legal complexities of the situation weren't lost on Daniel, but the immediate needs of his family took precedence in his mind. They could sort out the historical significance later, after they had secured their home. The strongbox itself was a formidable piece of engineering, designed specifically to resist theft during the lawless gold rush era. Constructed of hardened steel with a complex locking mechanism, these boxes had been the most secure method of transporting valuable cargo in the 1860s. This particular box appeared to have survived its unusual burial in remarkable condition, protected from the elements by the dry California soil. The lock, however, presented a significant challenge. Breaking into a Wells Fargo strongbox would require tools and expertise they didn't possess. "What about Mr. Ramirez?" Emma suggested, referring to their elderly neighbor who ran a small metalworking shop. "He's got cutting torches and all kinds of tools. Maybe he could help us open it." Daniel hesitated, weighing the wisdom of involving others. On one hand, they needed assistance with the strongbox. On the other, the more people who knew about their discovery, the greater the risk of complications. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Okay, but let's not tell him exactly what we found. We'll just say we discovered an old safe while working on the well." They carefully covered their find with a tarp, securing it from curious eyes before driving to the Ramirez workshop a few miles down the road. Manuel Ramirez had been a friend to the Fletcher family for decades, helping Daniel's father with farm equipment repairs and teaching Daniel himself about metalworking when he was a boy. Now in his 70s, the skilled metalworker had semi-retired, but still maintained a fully equipped shop beside his modest home. "A safe, you say?" Mr. Ramirez asked, his weathered face creased with curiosity as Daniel explained their discovery in carefully vague terms. "From the gold rush era? That's quite a find, Daniel. But why are you so eager to open it yourself instead of calling in experts?" The old man's eyes were shrewd, missing nothing. Daniel hesitated, caught between his respect for his neighbor and his desperate need for secrecy until they understood what they were dealing with. "The bank is about to take the farm, Manuel," Daniel admitted, deciding that a partial truth was necessary. "We're out of options. If there's anything of value in that safe, it might be our last chance to save the place." Understanding dawned in the older man's eyes. He had watched multiple family farms in the valley succumb to foreclosure over the years, had seen the heartbreak of generational farmers forced to surrender their heritage to corporate interests. Without another word, he collected his cutting equipment and followed them back to the Fletcher farm. When Mr. Ramirez saw the partially excavated stagecoach and recognized the distinctive Wells Fargo markings, his eyes widened in astonishment. "Dios mío," he whispered. "This isn't just any strongbox, Daniel. This could be—" He trailed off, clearly recognizing the historical significance of their find. After a moment's hesitation, during which Daniel feared the older man might insist on contacting authorities, Mr. Ramirez simply nodded. "Let's see what's inside. Your family has worked this land honestly for generations. Whatever is in there, you deserve a chance to save your home." With practiced skill, the elderly metalworker examined the antique lock mechanism, muttering to himself in Spanish as he determined the best approach. "These were built to resist tampering," he explained as he prepared his tools. "But they weren't designed to withstand modern cutting equipment." Working methodically, with a precision that belied his age, Mr. Ramirez began to cut through the hardened steel hinges of the strongbox, choosing a route that would preserve the lock itself for historical purposes, while still allowing them access to the contents. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they worked, the temperature climbing past 105 degrees as they labored in the exposed well pit. Emma brought water for all of them, and Daniel worried about the elderly man's health in the extreme heat. But Mr. Ramirez worked steadily, pausing only occasionally to wipe sweat from his brow and assess his progress. After nearly 2 hours of careful cutting, the strongbox hinges finally gave way with a protesting groan of metal that had remained sealed for over 150 years. Daniel, Emma, and Mr. Ramirez held their breath as the strongbox lid was finally lifted, revealing contents that had remained hidden since before the Fletcher family had ever set foot on this land. The interior of the box was lined with a dark velvet material, now faded and deteriorated with age but still recognizable as a luxury fitting appropriate for valuable cargo. What captured their attention, however, were dozens of canvas pouches, each roughly the size of a man's fist, neatly arranged within the compartment. A layer of dust and soil had infiltrated the box over the decades, but the contents appeared remarkably well preserved. With trembling hands, Daniel reached for the nearest pouch, feeling a substantial weight that sent his pulse racing. The canvas had stiffened with age but remained intact as he carefully untied the drawstring closure. Tipping the contents into his palm, he gasped as raw gold nuggets spilled forth, their distinctive luster unmistakable even beneath a century and a half of tarnish. "My God," Daniel whispered, voice barely audible over the sound of his pounding heart. "It's real. The gold is actually here." Emma stared wide-eyed at the treasure resting in her father's palm, the implications slowly dawning on her young face. "How much do you think is in there?" she asked, gesturing toward the remaining pouches. Mr. Ramirez, whose years in metalworking had given him a practiced eye for precious metals, carefully examined one of the nuggets. "This is significant," he said quietly. "These appear to be high-grade specimens, probably from the northern mines. If all these pouches contain similar quality gold—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the extraordinary sum they might be facing. As they continued to explore the strongbox contents, they discovered not only gold nuggets but several leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed but legible, detailing the specific origins and value of the shipment. According to the meticulous records, Coach 42 had been transporting $312,685 in raw gold from multiple mining operations, bound for the San Francisco Mint in today's currency. The value would be astronomical, potentially over $300 million, depending on current gold prices and the collectible premium such a historic find would command. Beneath the pouches of gold, they found another compartment containing personal effects, pocket watches, jewelry, and sealed letters that had never reached their destinations. These items told a more human story of the Stagecoach's final journey, reminders of the lives interrupted when Coach 42 vanished. Daniel handled these artifacts with particular reverence, acutely aware that they were touching items last seen by people who had lived and died before his great-great-grandfather had even purchased this land. "There's something else here," Emma said, reaching deeper into the strongbox to withdraw a leather folder secured with a tarnished brass clasp. Inside were several official-looking documents, the elaborate letterhead of Wells Fargo still visible despite the passage of time. As they carefully unfolded the brittle papers, they revealed shipping manifests, passenger records, and a detailed report on the route and security measures for the ill-fated journey. But what caught Daniel's attention was a handwritten letter, signed by the regional Wells Fargo manager and addressed to company headquarters in San Francisco. The letter described credible threats against the gold shipment and requested additional security personnel, a request that had evidently been granted too late. Reading between the lines of formal business correspondence, Daniel could sense the writer's anxiety about the substantial shipment and the increasing boldness of highway bandits in the region. The letter ended with a prophetic line that sent chills down Daniel's spine should Coach 42 fail to arrive as scheduled. "We must consider the worst scenario, that our security measures have been compromised from within. This suggests an inside job," Daniel said, carefully refolding the fragile document. "Someone at Wells Fargo might have been working with the bandits." Mr. Ramirez nodded thoughtfully, his weathered face grave as he considered the historical implications. But something must have gone wrong with their plan. Why bury the entire coach with the gold still inside? Why not simply take the gold and disappear? It was a compelling question, one that transformed their extraordinary find from mere treasure into a historical mystery that had remained unsolved for over a century and a half. As they continued to examine the Stagecoach, they discovered another compartment that had been concealed beneath the driver's seat, containing several revolvers and a significant amount of ammunition, standard security equipment for gold shipments during that dangerous era. But most telling was a leather-bound journal wedged beneath the weapons, its pages filled with cramped handwriting that appeared to be a personal account of the events surrounding the coach's disappearance. The journal belonged to Thomas Hargrove, one of the armed guards assigned to Coach 42, and his final entries painted a disturbing picture of betrayal and violence. According to Hargrove's account, the Stagecoach had been waylaid not by anonymous bandits, but by a faction of their own security detail who had conspired to steal the gold shipment. The plan had gone catastrophically wrong when the coach driver, apparently not part of the conspiracy, had attempted to escape, driving the vehicle off the established route and into what was then unsettled territory. "Listen to this," Daniel said, carefully reading from the journal's final pages. "Jenkins and Monroe have seized control of the coach after shooting Mr. Williams dead. They claim we will all share in the gold if I cooperate, but I have seen the way they look at each other. I do not expect to survive this betrayal. We have traveled far off our route into uninhabited country. No one will find us here. I write this in hope that someday justice might be done for Williams and myself, and that the rightful owners may recover their property." The journal ended abruptly, leaving the final fate of Thomas Hargrove and the conspirators to speculation. This land wasn't a farm then, Emma realized, putting the historical pieces together. Great-great-grandpa Samuel didn't buy it until 1878, a decade after the coach disappeared. The bandits must have buried the coach here when this was just empty land, planning to come back for it later. Daniel nodded, seeing the logic in her conclusion. But something prevented them from returning. Maybe they were caught or killed for other crimes. Or maybe they couldn't find the exact spot again in unmarked territory. The well, ironically, had been dug directly over the buried coach decades later, the Fletcher family unknowingly coming within feet of an extraordinary treasure for generations. As the full magnitude of their discovery sank in, Daniel felt a dizzying mix of emotions: elation at the solution to their financial problems, awe at the historical significance of what they'd found, and uncertainty about the legal and ethical implications of their next steps. The gold would unquestionably save their farm many times over, but it wasn't as simple as depositing ancient gold nuggets in their bank account. This was a historically significant find with complex ownership questions that would need to be navigated carefully. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, voicing the question foremost in all their minds. Mr. Ramirez, who had remained thoughtfully silent as they examined the Stagecoach contents, finally spoke. "You need legal advice, Daniel. This isn't just about the money. This is a significant historical discovery. There will be questions about ownership. Wells Fargo still exists, and they may have a claim. The state might assert rights to historical artifacts found on private property. You need to protect yourselves while doing the right thing." Daniel knew the older man was right. As desperately as they needed the money, simply selling the gold quietly would be legally questionable and ethically wrong. Not to mention practically difficult, unloading millions in historic gold nuggets would certainly attract attention. They needed professional guidance to navigate the complex intersection of treasure trove laws, historical preservation requirements, and modern property rights. But such expert counsel would be expensive, requiring resources they simply didn't have. "I know someone who might help," Mr. Ramirez offered, sensing Daniel's dilemma. "My niece, Gabriela, is an attorney in Sacramento specializing in property law. She has connections with historical preservation experts and museums. Let me call her." Daniel hesitated, acutely aware that each person they involved increased the risk of their discovery becoming public knowledge before they had secured their legal position. But they needed expert guidance, and Mr. Ramirez had already demonstrated his trustworthiness. While the elderly metalworker made his call from the privacy of his truck, Daniel and Emma began the painstaking process of documenting their find. Using Emma's smartphone, they photographed each aspect of the Stagecoach and its contents, creating a detailed record of exactly how and where each item had been discovered. Daniel knew from his engineering background that proper documentation would be crucial for both historical research and establishing the provenance of their find. As they worked, he couldn't help calculating rough estimates of the gold's value, each figure more staggering than the last. Gabriela Ramirez arrived at the Fletcher farm just as the summer sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the parched fields. In her mid-30s, she carried herself with the confident precision of a successful attorney. But her warm greeting to her uncle and genuine interest in the Fletcher family situation suggested she hadn't lost touch with her rural roots. After the necessary introductions, Daniel led her to the well site, watching her expression transform from professional curiosity to stunned disbelief as she took in the partially excavated Stagecoach. "When my uncle called, I thought perhaps you'd found some gold rush-era coins or mining equipment," she admitted, carefully examining the Wells Fargo markings on the coach. "This is unprecedented. A complete Stagecoach, documented gold shipment, historical accounts of what happened. Museums and historians will be falling over themselves to study this find." She turned to Daniel, her expression serious. "But first, we need to establish your legal position and protect your interests. This could be extremely valuable, but navigating the competing claims will be complicated." Over cups of strong coffee at the Fletcher kitchen table, Gabriela outlined the complex legal landscape they were facing. California law regarding found property generally favors the finder, but there are exceptions for items with historical significance. Wells Fargo could potentially claim ownership as the original shipper, though after 150 years, their claim might be legally tenuous. The State Historical Commission will certainly take an interest and may assert rights to preserve the artifacts for public benefit. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee before continuing. The good news is that you found this on your own property, which strengthens your position significantly. And there's legal precedent suggesting that even if other parties have claims to the gold itself, as the discoverers, you would be entitled to a substantial finder's fee, typically a percentage of the total value. Daniel felt a flicker of hope at these words. Even a percentage of $300 million would more than save their farm. What's our first step? He asked, acutely aware that the 30-day foreclosure deadline continued to tick relentlessly forward despite their extraordinary discovery. Gabriella considered the question carefully before responding. We need to formally document the find and secure it. Then we need to notify certain authorities, but strategically, in a way that protects your interests. I suggest bringing in a bonded archaeological team to properly excavate and preserve everything. That establishes that you're handling this responsibly, which will strengthen your position when negotiating how the value is distributed. Emma, who had been listening intently to the legal discussion, voiced the question most immediate to their situation. But what about our farm? The bank is going to foreclose in less than a month. We can't wait for all the legal details to be worked out. Gabriella nodded understandingly. That's why we need to move quickly on two parallel tracks. While we begin the formal process of documenting and reporting the find, I'll also approach the bank with enough information to demonstrate that your financial situation has fundamentally changed. Most banks would rather extend terms than foreclose, especially if there's clear evidence that you'll soon have means to pay. The next morning, under Gabriella's supervision, they began implementing their strategy. Her first call was to Dr. Eleanor Chun, a respected archaeologist from UC Davis specializing in Gold Rush-era artifacts. After signing a stringent confidentiality agreement, Dr. Chun arrived with a small team of graduate students. Their excitement barely contained as they set up a proper archaeological excavation around the well site. With professional equipment and expertise, they carefully unearthed more of the Stagecoach, documenting every detail with scientific precision. This is the archaeological equivalent of finding King Tut's tomb, Dr. Chun exclaimed, carefully brushing soil from the Stagecoach's ornate door panel. A perfectly preserved Wells Fargo coach from the height of the gold rush, with its cargo intact and documentation of what happened. This is unprecedented. My colleagues in historical archaeology will be studying this find for decades. Her enthusiasm was tempered with professional respect for the artifacts, ensuring that each item was properly preserved and cataloged as it was removed from the site. While the archaeological team worked, Gabriella arranged a meeting with Richard Tompkins, the regional manager of Western Pacific Bank, the institution threatening foreclosure on the Fletcher farm. Initially skeptical about vague references to a significant discovery on the property, Tompkins became considerably more attentive when Gabriella presented certified appraisals of sample gold nuggets from the find, along with preliminary historical documentation establishing the potential value of the complete discovery. Let me be clear, Mr. Tompkins, Gabriella stated with calm authority during their meeting. My clients have discovered historically significant artifacts worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. While the ultimate distribution of that value is subject to legal determination, there's no scenario in which the Fletchers won't receive a substantial portion, more than enough to satisfy their mortgage many times over. Foreclosing now would be short-sighted and potentially expose your bank to litigation for failing to make reasonable accommodations in light of changed circumstances. The bankers' initial skepticism had completely vanished by the conclusion of their meeting, replaced by almost obsequious cooperation. Of course, Ms. Ramirez, Western Pacific prides itself on working constructively with our agricultural clients through difficult times. I'm sure we can arrange a 6-month extension on the Fletcher mortgage while these remarkable developments unfold. His barely concealed eagerness to now be associated with the Fletchers and their discovery was not lost on Daniel, who remembered all too clearly the same man's cold dismissal of their hardship just weeks earlier. As news of their discovery spread through carefully controlled channels, the Fletcher farm became the center of intense interest from multiple quarters. Representatives from Wells Fargo's corporate archives arrived to authenticate the Stagecoach and its documentation. Historians specializing in California's gold rush period requested interviews. The State Historical Preservation Office sent officials to evaluate the find's significance to California heritage. Each entity brought competing interests and potential claims to portions of the discovery's value. Throughout this whirlwind of activity, Daniel found himself repeatedly drawn back to the leather-bound journal of Thomas Hargrove, the guard who had documented the Stagecoach's final journey. Something about the man's final words, written in the knowledge that he likely faced death, resonated deeply with Daniel's own sense of responsibility to his family and land. Hargrove had hoped for justice and for the gold to be returned to its rightful owners. After 150 years, determining those rightful owners had become a complex legal question. But Daniel felt a personal obligation to honor Hargrove's final wishes by ensuring the historical record was complete and accurate. Working with Dr. Chun and her team, Daniel pieced together the likely sequence of events following the Stagecoach's disappearance. Based on historical records and the physical evidence, they theorized that the conspirators had killed the loyal guard Hargrove and buried the coach intact, perhaps intending to return with better equipment to move the heavy gold shipment. Historical records revealed that 2 men matching the descriptions of the conspirators named in Hargrove's journal had been killed in a saloon shooting in Sacramento just weeks after Coach 42 vanished, potentially explaining why they had never returned for their buried treasure. As the archaeological work progressed, Emma developed an unexpected passion for the historical aspects of their discovery. Working alongside Dr. Chun's graduate students, she absorbed knowledge about archaeological techniques, gold rush history, and artifact preservation. When not helping with the excavation, she spent hours researching the historical context of the Stagecoach's journey, developing a detailed understanding of transportation systems during California's formative years. What had begun as their family's financial salvation was becoming an educational opportunity that expanded horizons beyond their small farming community. 3 weeks after their initial discovery, with the bank foreclosure successfully postponed, Gabriella called a meeting to discuss the final legal arrangement she had negotiated among the competing interests. Seated around the Fletcher kitchen table were representatives from Wells Fargo, the California Historical Society, the State Historical Preservation Office, and Dr. Chen representing academic interests. The agreement they had reached was complex but equitable, recognizing both historical significance and modern realities. After extensive negotiation, Gabriella explained, "We've reached terms that all parties find acceptable. The Stagecoach itself, along with all historical documents and artifacts not consisting of precious metals, will be preserved in the California State Railroad Museum, with appropriate recognition of the Fletcher family's discovery. Wells Fargo has agreed to authenticate the gold shipment based on their historical records but has waived any ownership claim in exchange for the historical materials and exclusive rights to feature the discovery in their corporate museum and marketing materials." She turned to the state representatives before continuing. "The state of California recognizes the historical significance of this find and has classified it as a historical treasure, which normally would give them certain rights. However, in recognition of the Fletcher family's proper handling of the discovery and willingness to ensure public access to the historical artifacts, the state has agreed to limit its claim to 15% of the gold's value, which will fund historical preservation throughout California." Finally, she addressed Daniel directly. As the discoverers and property owners, the Fletcher family will retain 85% of the monetary value of the gold, estimated at approximately $255 million after the state's portion. Wells Fargo has offered to handle the authentication, security, and sale of the gold through their precious metals division, waiving all fees in exchange for the marketing value of their association with this historic discovery. Daniel sat in stunned silence as the figures washed over him. Even after taxes, they would receive well over $100 million, an amount that transformed their future beyond recognition. The farm that had been days away from foreclosure would not only be saved, but could be modernized with the most advanced, sustainable farming technologies available. His children's education would be fully funded through whatever degrees they wished to pursue. The financial insecurity that had defined their existence for years had vanished overnight, replaced by possibilities he had never dared to imagine. But as the representatives exchanged congratulations and began discussing implementation details, Daniel found himself thinking not of the money, but of Samuel Fletcher, his great-great-grandfather who had purchased this land after arriving too late. For the original gold rush, there was a profound historical symmetry in the fact that the gold his ancestor had sought had been lying beneath their feet for generations, waiting to be discovered at precisely the moment when the family faced losing their heritage forever. It felt less like random luck and more like the completion of a historical circle that had begun over 150 years earlier. In the weeks following the legal agreement, the Fletcher farmstead transformed from a struggling operation on the verge of foreclosure to the center of a carefully orchestrated historical preservation and financial planning process. The archaeological team established a proper excavation site, complete with protective canopies to shield the stagecoach and its contents from the elements as they meticulously documented every aspect of the find. Security personnel, hired by Wells Fargo as part of their commitment to the project, maintained a discreet but vigilant presence around the clock, ensuring the safety of what had become one of the most significant gold rush artifacts ever discovered. Daniel found himself navigating a world entirely foreign to his experience as a farmer and agricultural engineer. Financial advisors assisted with establishing appropriate trusts and investment vehicles to manage their newfound wealth. Historical consultants facilitated the transition of artifacts to museums while ensuring the Fletcher family received proper recognition for their discovery. Media representatives sought exclusive rights to tell the story of Coach 42's disappearance and miraculous rediscovery a century and a half later. Through it all, Daniel remained grounded by his commitment to the land that had been in his family for generations. "This farm isn't just where we found the gold," he explained to a documentary filmmaker who had asked why he wasn't planning to move to a more luxurious property. "It's our heritage, our connection to the past and the future. We're not leaving. We're transforming it into something sustainable that can be passed down for generations to come." This sentiment became the guiding principle for how the Fletcher family chose to use their unexpected fortune. Rather than simply retiring to a life of luxury, Daniel developed a comprehensive plan to revitalize not just their own farm, but the surrounding agricultural community that had been devastated by drought and economic pressures. The first phase involved implementing cutting-edge water conservation technologies on the Fletcher farm, creating a model of sustainable agriculture in drought conditions that other farms could observe and potentially adopt. The gold was buried on this land for 150 years. Daniel told Emma as they reviewed architectural plans for a state-of-the-art irrigation system that would reduce water usage by 70% while maintaining crop yield. "It seems right that we use it to ensure this land remains productive for at least another 150 years. The plans included underground drip irrigation, soil moisture sensors, weather-responsive controls, and gray water recycling systems, technologies typically beyond the reach of family farms, but potentially revolutionary for agricultural sustainability in the region." Emma, whose experience with the archaeological team had ignited a passion for preserving history while embracing innovation, suggested establishing an agricultural education center on a portion of their property. What if we created a place where farmers could learn about new technologies and historical farming practices side by side? She proposed. We could show how traditional wisdom and cutting-edge science can work together. Daniel embraced the concept enthusiastically, seeing it as a way to honor both the gold rush history that had transformed their fortunes and the agricultural heritage that had sustained their family for generations. The Fletcher Agricultural Innovation Center began taking shape on 10 acres adjacent to their working farm. The facility included demonstration areas for various irrigation technologies, research laboratories where agricultural scientists could develop drought-resistant crop varieties, and a museum section dedicated to the evolution of farming practices in California from gold rush days to the present. At Emma's insistence, one wing of the center was dedicated to telling the story of Coach 42 and the broader history of transportation during California's formative years, featuring artifacts on loan from the California State Railroad Museum. As construction progressed, Daniel turned his attention to the broader community challenges. The surrounding farms, many of which had been in the same families for generations like the Fletcher property, were facing the same water and economic pressures that had nearly cost Daniel his own heritage. Rather than simply offering charity, which he suspected his proud farming neighbors might resist, Daniel established the Central Valley Agricultural Sustainability Fund, a program offering low-interest loans and grants for implementing water conservation technologies. This isn't about handouts, he explained at a community meeting in the local high school gymnasium, addressing farmers who regarded him with a mixture of envy and skepticism after his sudden wealth. This is about preserving a way of life and an agricultural tradition that's worth protecting. The gold we found belongs to history, but the future we build with it belongs to all of us. The program included technical assistance and engineering support, ensuring that farmers weren't just given money, but the knowledge and tools to transform their operations for long-term viability. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some community members viewed Daniel's initiatives with suspicion, questioning his motives or resenting his sudden rise from struggling farmer to wealthy philanthropist. Others saw opportunities to exploit his generosity, presenting dubious projects or exaggerated needs. Navigating these social complexities proved in some ways more difficult than the legal and financial challenges that had followed their discovery. People are complicated, Mr. Ramirez observed one evening as he and Daniel sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset over newly installed solar panels that powered their irrigation systems. When your circumstances change dramatically, it changes how people see you, even if you haven't changed at all. The elderly metalworker had become a trusted advisor and friend throughout the process, his practical wisdom and community connections proving invaluable as Daniel implemented his vision for the farm and community. "I never wanted to be wealthy," Daniel admitted, watching his younger sons play in the distance, their lives now transformed by educational and opportunity security they could never have imagined months earlier. "I just wanted to keep the farm, to pass something meaningful to my kids. Now we have resources beyond anything I could have dreamed, but the responsibility weighs on me every day. How do we use this gift in a way that honors its history and creates real value?" Mr. Ramirez nodded thoughtfully before responding. "That question itself is why the gold found its way to you, Daniel. Many would never ask it at all." The simple observation carried profound truth. Throughout the region's history, countless fortunes had been made and lost, from the original gold rush through agricultural booms and Silicon Valley wealth. What distinguished one legacy from another wasn't the magnitude of wealth, but the purpose to which it was directed. As the summer heat gradually yielded to autumn coolness, the first phase of the Fletcher farm transformation reached completion. The new irrigation systems operated with remarkable efficiency, allowing them to cultivate crops with a fraction of the water previously required. Solar arrays powered the farm operations, eliminating electricity costs while reducing their carbon footprint. Sensors throughout the fields monitored soil conditions and crop health in real time, enabling precision agriculture practices that optimized yields while minimizing resource use. The physical transformation of the property was impressive, but Daniel found deeper satisfaction in the changes taking place within his family. Emma, whose college plans had previously been limited by financial constraints, was now applying to top universities with programs in historical preservation and sustainable development. Her interests shaped by the extraordinary events of the past months. His younger sons, initially dazzled by the possibilities of wealth, had gradually returned to a grounded appreciation for the land itself, spending hours exploring the farm with a new understanding of its historical significance. Perhaps most meaningful was the evolution in Daniel's relationship with his late wife's memory. Catherine had died 4 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer, leaving him to raise their children alone and ultimately motivating their return to the family farm. In the desperate financial circumstances that had followed, Daniel had often wondered if he'd made the right choice, if Catherine would have approved of the risks he'd taken with their children's security. Now, as he established a charitable foundation in her name, focused on supporting single parents in rural communities, he felt a sense of completion, of honoring her memory in ways that would have resonated with her compassionate spirit. "Mom would have loved what we're doing," Emma remarked one evening as they reviewed applications for the foundation's first round of grants. "She always said that helping others wasn't charity, it was community." The observation carried particular weight coming from Emma, who had been closest to Catherine and had struggled the most with her loss. That she could now speak of her mother with peaceful remembrance rather than raw grief marked a healing that no amount of money could have purchased. As word of the Fletcher Agricultural Innovation Center spread throughout California's farming community, Daniel began receiving visitors from across the state and eventually beyond. Agricultural officials from other drought-affected regions, sustainability researchers, and historical preservationists interested in the unique combination of technological innovation and historical conservation. What had begun as a personal project to save their family farm was evolving into a model that others sought to emulate. The California State University system proposed a partnership, establishing a research outpost at the center where agriculture students could gain hands-on experience with sustainable farming technologies. International delegations from countries facing similar water scarcity challenges arranged tours to observe the systems in action. Even the state government took notice, with the Department of Agriculture citing the Fletcher farm as a case study in their guidelines for drought resilience. This growing recognition brought Daniel an unexpected opportunity when the governor appointed him to a newly formed commission on agricultural sustainability. Initially reluctant to step into a political role, Daniel ultimately accepted the position, seeing it as a chance to influence policies that would help other family farms survive the challenging transitions facing California agriculture. His practical experience as a working farmer, combined with his implementation of cutting-edge sustainability practices, brought a valuable perspective to discussions previously dominated by corporate, agricultural interests and academic theorists. "I never imagined I'd be testifying before state legislators," Daniel confessed to Emma after returning from his first commission meeting in Sacramento. "But they're making decisions that affect thousands of family farms without understanding the day-to-day realities of what that life entails. Someone needs to speak for the family farmers who don't have lobbyists or political connections." His appointment created a platform for advocating policies that balanced environmental sustainability with the economic realities of small-scale agriculture, helping to shape regulations that protected natural resources without imposing impossible burdens on family farms. 8 months after the discovery of Coach 42, the Fletcher family hosted a formal dedication, ceremony for both the Agricultural Innovation Center and the Catherine Fletcher Foundation. The event brought together an unlikely assemblage, farmers from throughout the region, academic researchers, museum curators, state officials, and descendants of Wells Fargo employees who had worked the Stagecoach routes during the gold rush era. The gathering represented the diverse threads that had been woven together by their extraordinary discovery. The ceremony took place beside the original well site, now transformed into a glass-enclosed viewing area, where visitors could see exactly where and how the Stagecoach had been found. Dr. Chun, whose archaeological team had meticulously documented the discovery, unveiled a detailed explanation of how the Stagecoach had likely been buried and how the Fletcher well had inadvertently been dug directly above it decades later. The presentation included a life-sized replica of Coach 42, constructed based on the measurements and details of the original, which now resided in the California State Railroad Museum. What makes this discovery truly remarkable isn't just the gold itself, but the window it provides into a pivotal moment in California history. Dr. Chun explained to the assembled guests. The gold rush transformed this state from a sparsely populated territory to the economic powerhouse it is today. Coach 42's journey, and its unexpected rediscovery, a century and a half later, connects us directly to that transformative period. Her academic perspective highlighted how the Fletcher family's find had significantly advanced historical understanding of transportation systems during the gold rush era. When it came time for Daniel to speak, he found himself reflecting not on the gold's monetary value, but on the deeper significance of their discovery. For generations, my family worked this land, unaware that just beneath our feet lay a direct connection to the history that shaped California, he began. I can't help but think about my great-great-grandfather Samuel, who came west seeking gold but arrived too late for the rush. He turned instead to farming, establishing the legacy we continue today. It seems fitting that the gold he sought finally found its way to his family, generations later, at exactly the moment we needed it most. Daniel gestured to the agricultural innovations visible across the farm before continuing. But the true value of what we discovered isn't in the gold itself. It's in what it's allowing us to build for the future. This center will help develop and disseminate technologies that allow family farms to survive in changing climate conditions. The foundation will support rural families facing hardships similar to what we experienced. In this way, a treasure from California's past becomes an investment in California's future. As he concluded his remarks, Daniel invited Emma to join him in unveiling the cornerstone of the Innovation Center. Inscribed with words that had become the family's guiding principle, from buried past to sustainable future. The phrase encapsulated their journey from the desperate search for water that had led to the discovery of historical gold to their current mission of ensuring water security for future generations of farmers. What had begun as a personal crisis had evolved into a vision that extended far beyond their family or farm. Following the ceremony, as guests toured the Innovation Center and farm, Daniel found a moment of quiet reflection at the edge of the property. From this vantage point, he could see the entire sweep of the Fletcher farm, the historic homestead where 5 generations of his family had lived. The new agricultural research facilities, the solar arrays that powered their operations, and the fields now thriving despite ongoing drought conditions. The transformation was remarkable, yet the essential character of the place remained unchanged. It was still fundamentally a working farm dedicated to producing food and sustaining a family connection to the land. Mr. Ramirez joined him in this contemplative moment, the elderly metalworker moving more slowly these days, but still sharp-eyed and insightful. "You've done something remarkable here, Daniel," he observed, gesturing toward the Innovation Center where dozens of farmers were engaged in animated discussions about irrigation technologies. "You've turned a personal windfall into a community resource." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I still feel like we just got lucky." If that well hadn't dried up, if Emma hadn't been determined to dig deeper, if you hadn't helped us open the strongbox, none of this would exist. The sequence of events that had led to their discovery still seemed miraculous in retrospect, a series of coincidences too perfect to be merely random. Perhaps, Mr. Ramirez replied thoughtfully. But luck finds its way to those prepared to recognize and use it wisely. Many might have found that gold and spent it all on themselves, leaving nothing of lasting value. The fact that you immediately thought about sustainability, community, and legacy, that wasn't luck. That was character. The observation carried particular weight, coming from a man who had known Daniel since childhood and had watched him navigate both hardship and sudden prosperity with the same fundamental integrity. As the sun began to set over the Fletcher farm, casting long shadows across fields that had nearly been lost to foreclosure less than a year earlier, Daniel found himself thinking about Thomas Hargrove, the stagecoach guard whose journal had documented Coach 42's final journey. Hargrove had hoped for justice and for the gold to find its rightful owners. After 150 years, the concept of rightful ownership had become legally complex, but Daniel believed they had honored the spirit of Hargrove's wish. The gold had been properly documented and acknowledged historically, with appropriate portions preserved for public benefit. And the majority was being used not for mere personal enrichment, but for creating sustainable systems that would benefit the broader community and future generations. In the gathering twilight, with his farm secure and flourishing around him, Daniel felt a profound sense of connection to the land his ancestors had worked, to the history that had unfolded beneath it unknown for generations, and to the future they were now helping to shape. The drought-stricken well that had nearly cost them everything had instead revealed a treasure beyond price, not just in gold, but in purpose. As he walked back toward the farmhouse where his children waited, Daniel reflected that perhaps this was the true legacy of the Fletcher farm, not the crops it produced or even the gold it had concealed, but the values it had nurtured across generations. Values that would continue to bear fruit long after the gold itself had been transformed into new possibilities. 5 years had passed since the day Daniel and Emma had climbed down into their dry well, desperate to find water but discovering historical gold instead. The Fletcher Agricultural Innovation Center had evolved from a local resource into an internationally recognized hub for sustainable farming practices. Farmers from 6 continents had visited, studied, and implemented technologies pioneered on the Fletcher farm. The center's research laboratory had developed drought-resistant crop varieties that were revolutionizing agriculture in arid regions worldwide. What had begun as one family's fight for survival had blossomed into a movement transforming how humanity approached food production in an era of climate uncertainty. On this particular morning, Daniel stood in a field of experimental wheat, developed through a partnership between the Innovation Center and 3 major universities. The variety required 40% less water than traditional wheat while yielding 15% more grain per acre, a breakthrough that could potentially change food security equations in drought-prone regions globally. Running his hand through the golden stalks, Daniel marveled at how different his daily concerns were now compared to those desperate days when he'd faced losing everything. "The latest soil moisture readings are perfect," called a voice from behind him. Daniel turned to see Dr. Amara Okafor, the brilliant agricultural scientist who had joined the center 3 years earlier, abandoning a prestigious university position to lead their research initiatives. "The root systems are developing exactly as we projected. If these results hold through harvest, we'll be ready for wider field trials next season." Her excitement was palpable, and justifiably so. This wheat variety represented years of painstaking research and could impact millions of lives in food-insecure regions. "Have the results from the Indian test plots come in yet?" Daniel asked, referring to a parallel trial being conducted in drought-affected regions of Maharashtra state. The global scope of their work still sometimes surprised him, from focusing on saving one family farm. He now participated in agricultural initiatives spanning continents. Dr. Okafor nodded, pulling up data on her tablet. Just this morning. Their yields are consistent with our projections, even under more severe conditions than we're testing here. The local farmers are already asking about wider implementation. As they walked back toward the research facility, Daniel reflected on how profoundly his understanding of wealth had evolved. The financial security from the gold discovery had initially seemed like the primary blessing, the means to save their farm and provide for his children's futures. But the true wealth had emerged in unexpected forms: the knowledge they'd developed, the community they built, the global impact of their work, and perhaps most significantly, the sense of purpose that infused their daily efforts. Inside the main building, the center hummed with activity. Graduate students analyzed crop data, engineers refined irrigation systems, and visiting farmers observed demonstrations of water conservation technologies. The original farmhouse, now restored and expanded, served as an administrative hub while maintaining its historical character. Daniel had insisted on preserving this connection to the Fletcher family's past, even as they built toward the future. Emma's voice carried from the historical wing, where she was conducting a tour for university students. At 22, she had completed her undergraduate degree in agricultural history and was pursuing graduate studies in sustainable development. Her unique perspective, bridging historical understanding with forward-looking innovation, had become integral to the center's philosophy. During breaks from her studies, she led educational programs that helped visitors understand how agricultural practices had evolved from gold rush days to the present, and how historical lessons informed modern sustainability efforts. The gold that transformed our family's fortunes came from an era when California's resources seemed limitless, Emma was explaining to her attentive audience. Miners diverted entire rivers, clear-cut forests, and fundamentally altered landscapes in pursuit of immediate wealth. Today, we understand that true prosperity requires balance with natural systems. The technologies we're developing here aren't about extracting maximum value in the short term. They're about creating sustainable relationships with the land that can endure for generations. Daniel smiled as he passed the classroom, proud of the thoughtful young woman his daughter had become. Emma had transformed their family's extraordinary luck into a personal mission, connecting historical understanding with future solutions. She embodied the best possible outcome of their discovery, not just financial security, but purpose and perspective that money alone could never provide. In his office, Daniel found Caleb and Noah, his younger sons now 15 and 13, working on their own project. The boys had inherited their father's engineering aptitude and were developing a simplified drip irrigation system that could be implemented with locally available materials in developing regions. Their design eliminated the need for expensive components or specialized tools, potentially making precision irrigation accessible to small-scale farmers worldwide. "We think we solved the clogging problem," Caleb announced without looking up from the prototype they were assembling. "Noah figured out we could use readily available mesh materials as filters if we layer them in this specific pattern." The brothers worked seamlessly together, complementing each other's strengths in a way that reminded Daniel of his own childhood collaborations with his brother. Their privileged circumstances hadn't produced entitlement, but instead nurtured a sense of responsibility to create solutions for those without access to advanced technologies. The materials for this entire system would cost less than $20 in most countries, Noah added, his expression serious beyond his years. And it could increase yields by at least 30% while cutting water usage in half. The boys had spent their summer vacation testing prototypes with actual farmers, refusing the exotic trips or luxury experiences that their family's resources could have provided. Instead, they'd chosen to immerse themselves in the practical realities of agricultural challenges, developing empathy alongside technical solutions. Daniel's scheduled video call with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reminded him how far their influence had spread. What had begun as local innovation was now being incorporated into international food security initiatives. The Fletcher Center's approach, combining cutting-edge technology with economically viable implementation strategies for small-scale farmers, had proven particularly valuable as climate change disrupted traditional growing regions worldwide. As he prepared for the call, Daniel reflected on a conversation with Mr. Ramirez that had profoundly shaped his approach to their unexpected fortune. The elderly metalworker, who had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, had shared wisdom that continued to guide the Fletcher family's decisions. Gold becomes truly valuable not when you possess it, but when you transform it into something greater than itself, he had said. Throughout history, the most remembered people aren't those who accumulated wealth, but those who directed resources towards solving meaningful problems. The Fletcher family had taken this philosophy to heart, ensuring that their gold discovery created ripples of positive impact extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. The Catherine Fletcher Foundation now supported hundreds of rural families, facing hardships similar to what they had experienced, providing not just financial assistance but mentoring, educational opportunities, and connections to sustainable farming initiatives. The second chances they facilitated for struggling farm families had become their most gratifying achievement, more meaningful than any luxury their wealth could have purchased. The international video conference brought together agricultural officials from 12 countries, facing severe drought conditions. Daniel's role was not to impose American solutions, but to share adaptable principles that communities could implement within their cultural and economic contexts. The technologies themselves are only half the equation, he explained to the assembled officials. Equally important is developing locally appropriate implementation strategies that farmers can sustain without ongoing external support. Our most successful programs are those where we listen first, then collaborate on solutions tailored to specific regional challenges. This philosophy of partnership rather than prescription had distinguished the Fletcher Center's approach from many well-intentioned but ultimately unsuccessful international development initiatives. Rather than positioning themselves as saviors bringing solutions to problems, they emphasized collaboration with local farmers whose generations of agricultural knowledge proved invaluable when adapting new technologies to specific environments. The resulting hybrid approaches often proved more effective than either traditional methods or imported technologies alone could have achieved. After the conference concluded, Daniel walked to the memorial garden established in Mr. Ramirez's honor. The peaceful space featured native drought-resistant plants surrounding a small fountain, powered by solar energy, a fitting tribute to a man who had embraced both traditional wisdom and technological innovation. Daniel often came here when making difficult decisions, finding that the serene environment helped clarify his thinking. Today, he was contemplating the center's future direction as climate challenges intensified globally. Extreme weather events were becoming more frequent, disrupting agricultural systems worldwide. The center's work had focused primarily on water conservation and drought resistance, but emerging needs suggested expanding their research into flood resilience, heat adaptation, and cultivation methods for increasingly unpredictable growing seasons. These expanding challenges would require additional resources and partnerships beyond what they had established. As Daniel considered these questions, Emma joined him in the garden, intuitively understanding her father's need for reflective space. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before she spoke. "I've been thinking about great-great-grandfather Samuel," she said, referring to their ancestor who had arrived too late for the original gold rush. He must have felt such disappointment when he discovered the easy gold was gone. But that disappointment led him to farming, which sustained our family for generations and ultimately led to us finding the gold anyway, a century and a half later. Her observation crystallized something Daniel had been feeling but couldn't quite articulate. "It's like the gold was waiting for the right moment," he replied. "Not just when we personally needed it most, but when it could serve a greater purpose." The timing of their discovery, coinciding with unprecedented agricultural challenges, driven by climate change, suddenly seemed less random and more providential. The resources that might have been squandered on personal indulgence in an earlier era were instead being directed toward innovations that could help humanity adapt to a changing world. This perspective infused their work with deeper meaning, suggesting that perhaps they weren't just lucky beneficiaries of a historical accident, but stewards of resources that had emerged at a crucial moment for a specific purpose. Whether one viewed this through a lens of spiritual significance or historical coincidence, the practical effect was the same: a sense of responsibility to ensure their unexpected fortune created the greatest possible positive impact. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Innovation Center campus, Daniel and Emma walked toward the original well site, now preserved under a protective structure, with educational displays explaining the Stagecoach discovery. School groups and tourists regularly visited this spot where history and future had intersected so dramatically, learning not just about gold rush transportation, but about how a crisis had transformed into opportunity through ingenuity and perseverance. "Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if the well hadn't dried up that summer," Emma mused as they stood looking down at the preserved excavation site. "We would have just kept struggling along, maybe eventually lost the farm, never knowing what was beneath our feet the whole time." The counterfactual scenario highlighted how thin the line between disaster and opportunity could be, how what appeared to be failure often contained the seeds of unexpected possibilities. "The drought forced us to dig deeper," Daniel replied, the statement carrying both literal and metaphorical significance. "Sometimes we only discover our greatest resources when circumstances push us beyond what we thought were our limits." This philosophy had become central to the educational programs they offered, teaching not just agricultural techniques but resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to transform challenges into catalysts for innovation. The evening brought a gathering of the extended Fletcher family, including Daniel's brother and his family who had provided crucial support during their financial crisis years earlier. These regular reunions maintained connections that transcended geography and circumstances, keeping the family grounded in the values that had preceded their dramatic change in fortune. Over dinner prepared with produce from their experimental gardens, conversation flowed between personal updates and discussions of emerging agricultural challenges worldwide. Daniel's nephew Jason, now in his final year of agricultural college, was describing his upcoming internship in drought-affected regions of East Africa. "I'll be working with small-scale farmers to implement some of the techniques pioneered here," he explained enthusiastically. "The local agricultural extension officers have already identified communities eager to test the modified irrigation systems." His excitement reflected how the Fletcher Center's influence had rippled through the extended family, inspiring younger generations to apply their talents toward meaningful challenges rather than merely lucrative careers. As stars appeared in the clear California sky, the family moved to the farmhouse porch, continuing conversations in the cool evening air. This simple pleasure, gathering with loved ones under the same stars that had watched over generations of Fletchers, provided perspective on what truly constituted wealth. The gold discovery had secured their financial future, but these bonds of family and purpose represented riches of a more fundamental kind, the type that sustained human hearts through challenges no amount of money could resolve. Looking across at his 3 children engaged in animated conversation with their cousins, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for their material security, but for the values that had guided their response to unexpected fortune. Emma's historical perspective, Caleb and Noah's engineering ingenuity, and the entire family's commitment to creating solutions. Rather than merely consuming resources, these qualities would serve them well regardless of financial circumstances. The gold had provided opportunity, but their character would determine what they created with that opportunity. The following morning brought a milestone event, the ceremonial harvest of the first full-scale test plot of their new wheat variety. Agricultural officials, researchers, and media representatives gathered to witness what preliminary data suggested would be record-breaking yields using minimal water resources. The implications for global food security were significant enough to attract international attention, with the Fletcher Center suddenly at the center of agricultural innovation worldwide. As harvesting equipment moved through the golden field, sensors collected real-time data confirming their most optimistic projections. The drought-resistant wheat was outperforming standard varieties by margins that could transform cultivation possibilities in water-stressed regions worldwide. What had begun as one family's desperate search for water had culminated in an innovation potentially benefiting millions of people. They would never meet a transformation of crisis into opportunity that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. Standing at the field's edge watching this tangible manifestation of years of research and development, Daniel found himself thinking again about Thomas Hargrove, the stagecoach guard whose journal had documented Coach 42's final journey. Hargrove had hoped for justice and for the gold to be returned to its rightful owners after the betrayal he witnessed. Though the legal definition of ownership had evolved over the intervening century and a half, Daniel believed they had honored the spirit of Hargrove's wish by ensuring that the gold created widespread benefit rather than merely private enrichment. As the successful harvest concluded and the gathered officials applauded the groundbreaking results, Daniel gathered his family for a private moment away from the cameras and congratulations. "Remember when we were just trying to save our farm?" he asked, embracing Emma, Caleb, and Noah. "Look what that struggle has become." What had begun as a desperate last attempt to find water had transformed not only their family's circumstances, but potentially agricultural practices worldwide. The crisis that had seemed like their worst nightmare had instead revealed resources deeper than they had imagined possible, not just the gold itself, but the purpose, innovation, and global impact that had emerged from their response to unexpected fortune. As the California sun illuminated the thriving fields around them, fields that had nearly been lost to foreclosure and drought just 5 years earlier, the Fletcher family stood united by more than DNA or shared history. They were connected by a common understanding that true wealth lay not in what one possessed, but in what one created, not in resources accumulated, but in challenges transformed. The gold discovered beneath their struggling farm had provided opportunity, but their choices had transformed that opportunity into legacy, innovations, that would continue bearing fruit long after the gold itself had been spent. The stagecoach buried during California's first great transformation had emerged during its second, as climate change forced fundamental reconsideration of how humanity related to natural resources. In this synchronicity, the Fletcher family found meaning beyond coincidence, a sense that perhaps history itself contained wisdom, waiting to be discovered by those willing to dig deeper, to look beyond immediate circumstances toward possibilities not yet imagined. The gold that had failed to reach its intended destination a century and a half earlier had ultimately funded innovations more valuable than its original purpose, creating not just wealth, but solutions to challenges its original owners could never have anticipated. As they walked back toward the innovation center that had emerged from their crisis, surrounded by fields that now served as living laboratories for agricultural transformation, Daniel reflected that perhaps this was the true gold rush legacy, not the pursuit of quick riches that had drawn thousands west in the 1800s, but the resilience, innovation, and community building that had ultimately sustained California through boom and bust cycles across generations. By directing their unexpected fortune towards solving meaningful problems rather than merely accumulating more, the Fletcher family had honored the best aspects of that complex historical legacy while helping to create a more sustainable future. The treasure that had been buried beneath their failing farm for generations had emerged at precisely the moment when it could serve its highest purpose, not merely saving one family's heritage, but potentially helping to secure humanity's food future in an era of unprecedented environmental challenges. In this, Daniel found a sense of completion, of participating in something larger than individual fortune or misfortune. The drought that had threatened everything they valued had instead revealed foundations deeper than their house, foundations of resilience, transformation, and the human capacity to turn adversity into opportunity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.